All right, sorry about the interruption. So this is video 2 for AP Euro on the weekend of December 1st and 2nd for the revolution in politics. We were talking about the Treaty of Paris. We said that Canada and all of French territory east of the Mississippi was now British territory. France gave Louisiana to Spain to compensate losing Florida to the British. So the British take over Florida for about the next 20 years. Louisiana is taken over by Spain, and basically France is out of any kind of claims in the continental part of North America. They'll maintain islands in the Caribbean or the West Indies, but not in the actual continent. France also lost most of their holdings in India, making the British the dominant European country in India as well. Britain had monopolized a vast trading and colonial empire, but at tremendous war debt. So this is where we get into why the revolutions happened because of the 7 Years' War. Basically, Britain and France had all fought so hard and so long in these wars, they became bankrupt and so devastated by all the financial loss of these wars that now they had to do something about it. France also emerged humiliated from the war and broke. They were still making money from their Caribbean islands, West Indies islands, from like their coffee and sugar production there. But the British and French both had to raise taxes to help repay their loans, and we know how that's going to go in the 13 colonies. It led to a storm of protests in the colonies as well as in France itself, and demands for reform. And so you see the seeds of revolution being sown here as a result. So now we're going to go on to the American Revolution. So in this unit, we're going to talk about the three major revolutions: the American, the French, and the Haitian. The first one we're going to talk about is the American one because it kind of spawns the other ones. The increased taxes and government control were a crucial factor behind the colonial protests in the New World. Participants from the 13 colonies in the Revolution believed they were only demanding traditional rights of English men and women. So they thought their rights were being infringed upon or being taken away, and they just wanted to keep what they believed were traditional rights of English men and women. But the liberal rights they wanted had strong democratic and popular overtones, so they're not really trying to be only like they've always been in England. They also want to have a greater sense of representative government and democracy. America's example would have a forceful impact in France and its colonies, which we'll see that later on in the unit. Okay, so first we're looking at the origins of the Revolution. The 7 Years' War had doubled the British national debt. The government anticipated needing more money to help defend its now 500 million acres of new territory. That's 500 million with a B. So they now had 500 million more acres of territory. So they figure they want to make sure their military stays strong and gets more money, so they need to raise taxes. They broke colonial traditions of loose involvement by maintaining a large army after the 7 Years' War and then beginning a series of taxes. So basically, for 150 plus years, the 13 colonies have been left alone to govern themselves. And now all of a sudden you're going to have a bunch of British soldiers stay behind to help occupy the territory as well as raise taxes to help fund their occupation. It leads to several acts, but the most famous one is the Stamp Act in 1765. Parliament passed this act which levied taxes on many commercial and legal documents, diplomas, newspapers, almanacs, and playing cards. All kinds of different legal papers and commercial papers were now being taxed, many of which were actually produced in the colonies, and you basically had to use them, you had to pay a tax, which, before this they've had import taxes, but that's not a big deal because you just don't buy the import. But now you can't really avoid it. This action seemed reasonable to the British, who already had a similar tax back in England and was much heavier. So they already had similar stamp taxes back in England. Basically, the British themselves were paying the bigger foot of the bill, but the French-Indian War itself was started by the colonists. So the British thought, well, you should help pay for this war since you basically started it, and so they thought this tax was very reasonable. And in fact, the tax itself was very cheap. It was actually really only a few extra pennies on top of what they were already paying. So they thought the whole thing was very reasonable. But the colonists did not think it was reasonable. Even though the money was also going towards their colonial defense with the soldiers being there. The colonists decided to protest with riots, some physical altercations with their tax collectors, also boycotting. That's going to become the overall most effective thing that the colonists do is boycott, because not everybody's going to be radical and attack tax collectors, but everybody could just refuse to buy British goods. And so after about a year of this, Parliament decides to reluctantly repeal it because it hurt them more than it helped them. They weren't making enough money off the trade and the tax anyway, so they repealed it reluctantly. There was also conflicts over new territories because as a result of the 7 Years' War, the 13 colonies got a lot more access to land to the Mississippi. The land-squeezed colonists quickly moved west of the Appalachian Mountains with newly won land. This sparked a lot of conflicts with Native Americans. There were Native Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains, so there was a lot of conflicts that resulted between those colonists expanding. To stop another costly war, like Parliament basically didn't want their colonies to start another big conflict like they had before, so Parliament passed what's called the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763, which created this imaginary line that basically ran alongside the mountains. Basically, it said you could not cross over and settle west of the mountains. So all this open area now from here to the Mississippi would be Indian territory and not territory the settlers could take over. The proclamation did very little to stop the migrant flow, and in fact just made things worse between the British and the colonists because it just made them more resentful. They felt like they fought long and hard to get that land. They want to have access to it to be able to have more farmland or live on it, whatever the case may be. Okay, colonial administration question. So the main issue then becomes how can the British reassert itself over colonial elected governments? The colonies have had elected governments now for decades, over a century. How does the government reassert itself with influence and not take away their rights or make them feel like their rights are being taken away? And also the question then becomes, who makes the laws for America? Forever, basically, the Americans themselves have been making their laws, including taxes. So when it comes to lawmaking, there's some British laws from Parliament that affect them, but for day-to-day stuff, it's all made in the colonies themselves by their elected officials. Parliament believed that it represented all British subjects in the empire, just like people back in Great Britain. People back in Britain don't vote for Parliament, but yet it represents the people there. So they thought the same thing about the colonies. Many Americans disagreed, and so Parliament was seen as a threat to American liberties. Basically, the colonists believed that the whole idea of no taxation without representation. You got to have an American or Americans in the Parliament for it to be truly representative government. And because that never happened, they feel like Parliament didn't truly represent them, even though that's how Parliament's always operated and has always led all of its empire. So there's a big conflict now over this issue. For the most part, the American colonies were happy to be under British control as long as they were left alone. But as soon as they start trying to interfere with their day-to-day lives and pass these taxes and stuff, it makes the colonists very upset. You also look at British colonial customs. Americans resisted these changes because of the degree of independence they've long enjoyed. No powerful established church existed in the colonies. Essentially they had a lot of freedom in how they worshipped and how they did religion. Also, their colonial assemblies had always made their laws. They have colonial assemblies going back to the 1620s. So those colonial assemblies have always made their laws, not some random group of people back in Europe. And white males with property had long enjoyed the right to vote. And they don't want to lose that right to vote on people who vote for their taxes and vote for the laws that affect them. America also had more social and economic equality. There was no nobility or strong, strict social classes or caste system that really existed in America. There was a lot more social and economic equality. No hereditary nobility with special privileges. And they didn't want that to start happening here instead in America like they had in Europe. Also, America was a society dominated by a bunch of independent farmers. And I say farmers, that also includes like wealthy plantation owners. But a lot of these guys were very wealthy farmers who dominated how they operated. They weren't all nobles or religious figures or, these different people that typically led back in Europe. Okay, we'll do the Road to Revolution, and then I guess we'll stop there. That should be good. In 1773, the British issued a tea tax to help out the struggling East India Company. So the East India Company was struggling to make profits in the 70s, so they issued a tea act to help them out. The act gave the company a more direct monopoly in the colonies. The act gave the company a more direct monopoly in the colonies, and it excluded a lot of the colonial merchants. So that's what happens. The Tea Act actually takes away a lot of the profits that colonial merchants have been making. The tea also even became cheaper. So because of the Tea Act and because of smuggling, people weren't always buying the tea. So Britain's actually trying to help out the company out by saying, hey, let's make the tea cheaper so the colonists will be more willing to buy it. But again, even though the tea price got cheaper, it still reflected the idea of no taxation without representation. Essentially, they had no say in the matter, which they didn't appreciate. So some radical Americans decided to go to Boston Harbor, dress like Native Americans, and in a rowdy protest, board East India Company ships in Boston Harbor and dump the tea into the harbor, which resulted in like tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. Parliament then issued the Coercive Acts. Parliament then issued the Coercive Acts in 74, which closed Boston's port, stopped many of their elections, and gave the royal governor of Massachusetts more power. It gave the royal governor of Massachusetts more power. So this was like a red alarm going off, because now you see their voting power taken away, they closed their trade port, and they're giving more power to royal authority over like the colonial elected authority. So there was a lot of resistance and rejection of Parliament's actions by Massachusetts, but other colonies too. This led to the first big meeting of all the colonists in the First Continental Congress in 75. Oh, I'm actually sorry, that's actually 74. I should say 74, not 75. I'll fix that later. But 74. So the first big meeting of all the colonists were in 74, where they all came together and tried to figure out a peaceful solution to how to deal with Parliament. The radicals at the meeting successfully argued against concessions. So instead of trying to basically concede to the British, they wanted to find a compromise. Parliament made no such compromise and actually sent over more soldiers, which led to fighting breaking out in April of 75. So fighting broke out like at Lexington and Concord by April of 75, which led to the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. So that's what we're going to cover on Monday when we come back. We'll talk about the Revolutionary War and how it plays out, and then we'll kind of see how America develops long term, and then we might even get into France a little bit too. We shouldn't spend a whole lot of time on all this because obviously y'all know a lot of this, but we'll see how it goes. You have a good weekend, and we'll see you on